I just pretty much kind of wing it, and sometimes it makes sense and sometimes it doesn't, but I usually can figure out how to pretend that it does. But I brought a bunch of notes today because of the topic, because I think the topic is really important and really serious. It's, if I remember the topic, editors and agents, are they still out there? I can give you the three-word answer. No. Yes. Maybe. We live into a time where the whole publishing industry is essentially dead. Last year there were more self-published books than traditionally published books. And books purchased by publishing houses across the board in all categories were down. What this essentially means is there are more people publishing books than reading them. You know, which is not necessarily good for an industry. And you can't sustain that way. And the traditional model of the book publisher can't last. It's just too expensive to print, it's too expensive to ship. Distributions, bookstores, libraries, everything argues against the publisher even being able to break even, let alone make money. So there has to be some new models coming up, and while we're in this sort of in-between state, while people are trying to figure out if in fact there are new models, we're still trying to figure out how do we get an agent, how do we get an editor, how do we get a publisher. I thought I would begin with sort of success stories first before I go into something else. And the key to me to these success stories is how everyone is a fluke. Okay?
Say it again?
Everyone is a fluke in a way.
Okay.
Okay, so on the one hand it's hopeful because you can hear these stories, but they're also all kind of fluky. And I know even when I go into the News and Observer to pick out books to review, and I've been reviewing books since 1981, 82, you used to be able to go into a newspaper office and you had a sense that the publishers knew what they were doing. You know, what they're putting out each season, why they're putting it out, sort of kind of themes. Now it's like Jackson Pollock. You go into an office of a book editor and it's like publishers just threw everything up hoping something would stick, but they had no clue why they were publishing anything. So you're going into an industry where people aren't really making intelligent decisions. It was about last year sometime Simon & Schuster started actually jobbing out the editorial decisions. The book editors no longer decide which books get purchased. They jobbed it out to an internet firm where what they do is they give like a little short 3-4 sentence summary of a whole series of books. And that's randomly distributed, this firm randomly distributed to people on the net, and they just check off which ones they might buy. Now these are probably people who wouldn't buy books to begin with, okay? That's how Simon & Schuster decides which books to publish. You know, and even in traditional publishing houses, my first book, Time Sharing, was published by Viking Penguin. My editor there, Pat Mulcahy, was a senior editor. She overruled the sales department. They didn't want to sell it because they didn't understand the demographics. What's the demographics? And she purchased it. At that time, she was buying 17 books a season in the 4 seasons. You know, so as a senior editor, she only purchased 68 books a year, and that was a lot because she was a senior editor. The lesser editors didn't publish half that. The last time I talked to her, probably about 6-7 years ago, she was down to 4 books a year as a senior editor that she could publish. Okay, that's the reality of the situation. You used to be able to pitch publishers, you really can't anymore. And even back in the 80s and 90s, it was difficult to pitch publishers because you never got to the editor, you always got an assistant editor. And in the New York circles, if you were an assistant editor, if you passed a book along to your editor and said, look, I think this is a good book, we should publish it. If your editor didn't like it, then all of a sudden you're judging a suspect. If you never passed a book along, you never had a book rejected, you were a good editor. And people had whole careers never passing a book along suggesting it be published. I was able, on my second novel, to get access directly to editors of publishing houses, major publishing houses, as I was working through agencies too. You can't do that now. Publishers and poets and writers rather, had an interview with 4 editors sometime within the past year. And it was real interesting for how they pretended that they read manuscripts. Every one of them said, we don't have any time during our day to read manuscripts. We get on the train, they all live in Connecticut. We get on the train, 6:30, 7 in the morning, we go into New York. We have to spend our entire day just basically marketing. We get back home at 7, the wife, 2, 3 kids, and so we read these manuscripts at night on weekends. What the hell they do? You know, I mean, you know they don't do that. There's no way. You know, there's just too many manuscripts. They're not going to do it. So what are they doing? They're looking for reasons to reject it, or they're looking for, like, simple summaries. The final decision in publishing houses now made by sales departments who don't read the book. The editor gets a 5-minute pitch, and the pitch is focused on why it will sell, who's going to buy it, how it's like everything else in that genre, and how it's totally different. You know, but it's not based on writing, quality of writing, how unusual it was. I had a novel that never got published, and a senior editor at Putnam said, "This is the greatest first-person novel since Canoes and Stranger." But the sales department doesn't know how to sell it. So it's like, well, all right, I'd rather have them tell me it's a piece of crap, but you know, what are you going to do? Yes?
Just a quick point. If you had said you were not talking about the book industry but the popular music industry,
Same thing.
it would all fit.
Same thing. And I actually have a client who has really close ties with the music industry. I'll talk about her in a little while. But anyways, it's a really difficult time, and I don't mean to be totally negative, but you need to understand the reality of the situation. And in a world like that, the only thing you can do to try to give yourself a chance is to work really hard. And I think people trying to rush it, right? We talked about this before, too quickly. You know, it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of studying, a lot of training to get to the point where your manuscript is ready. I do a lot of editing with people. I can get people in the door. My most recent client got in ICM, which is the top agency in the world. I can get you in the door, I can't get you a contract. But I can get your manuscript and your query letter to the point where people are going to look at it. But the hard work is ultimately up to you, you know. Anyway, success stories. Angela Davis Gardner, I don't know if anyone's familiar with her. She had published a couple novels, major publishers. I don't have it here. I edited an anthology of North Carolina writers back in '83, and I had a section of one of her unpublished novels at that time in it. And she had published a couple novels, could not get anybody to take her new novel. She went through 3 agents, absolutely wore out every opportunity. The book was dead. Through a fluke, she had left a section of it by accident on an airplane, and a librarian read it. Okay, really liked that section. Put her in contact with the people at, I think it was University of Wisconsin Press, who at that time, they weren't publishing real fiction so much, but Angela also knew the editor then. So you get the fluke of the librarian, the fluke of the contact, and because of that, the editor said, okay, we'll look at your manuscript. Okay, they looked at the manuscript, it was 400 pages, and said, you need to cut 100 pages. Not necessarily because they weren't good, because the realities of publishing, we can't publish a 400-page book.
Right.
You know, so she cut the pages out, got no advance for it, came out and she thought that was the end of it. She literally thought that was the end of her career. She would never publish again. At least she got this book out. At most 1,000 people would see it. That was it. A bookstore owner, who I don't want to name because she does not want to be inundated with people asking her to handle their book, was friends with Angela, was personal friends with Angela, and loved the book. Hand sold 1,200 copies of that book. Called in all her chips, got all her other friends who were in the independent bookstore industry to push this book. They sold 1,200 copies, at which point the bookstore owner could go to a well-known agent and say, look, I've got this book, it sold 1,200 copies, everybody loves it, all these book groups are reading it. And parlayed that into a 2-book contract for big money, and Angela could quit her job.
Yay.
Okay?
Wow. That's great.